All right, let's talk about our class today, our lecture today. We're talking about the Christian Empire period. We're already spoken about the Apostolic Church. We've already spoken about the early church. Now we're in the period that I call the Christian Empire. And you can see the dates that I assigned to the Christian Empire. The year 312. What happened in the year 312? One of our Bible college students for credit? Conversion of Constantine. Okay? Which led to, it didn't happen instantaneously, but it led to the Christianization of the Roman Empire. What happens around 1500? What's the date I have up there? 1500. What happened around 1500? The Reformation. So in this long period between the Christianization of the Roman Empire and the Reformation, we have this long period of dominance of what is known as the Roman Catholic Church. Now we've divided this period into two halves. We divided the period into an early period going up to about the year 1000, and now we're going to talk about the latter period of the Christian Empire period, approximately 1000 to 1500. Now, our focus in this lecture is going to be on the church in the West and what we would commonly call the Roman Catholic Church. Last week, Pastor Lance spoke to you all about the church in the East, and he spoke to you about groups outside of the institutional church, whether they be in the West or the East. Two of them are very important subjects, extremely important subjects to consider in the history of Christianity. It is a terrible mistake to think that all of the history of Christianity happens within the institutional Roman Catholic Church. Nevertheless, we do not apologize for having a focus upon the church in the West and what came out of Europe and such for this simple reason. Listen, there is much for us to understand, there's much for us to gain, there's much for us to lock into in the church in the East and in these movements that came up outside of the institutional churches, but you cannot deny that the church in the West has influenced the world much more than the church in the East. And I'm not trying to say that the church in the East doesn't have its place and hasn't been used of God, and always remember this about the church in the East, always remember this, that the vast majority of people who have been martyred from their faith have been in the East, not in the West. I don't know what the proportion would be. Maybe it's 80-20. I don't know. But the Eastern world of Christianity has absorbed far more persecution through the centuries than the Western form. So I'm not trying to say I'm putting down the Eastern form of Christianity whatsoever, but you just have to admit the modern world today has been influenced by Western Christianity, by Latin Christianity, much more than it has been by Eastern Christianity. So that's what we're going to focus on in this lecture. We're going to cover our main bases here in this idea. Number one, we're going to talk about general trends and characteristics. A few important events and trends through this 500-year period, 1000 to 1500. The second thing that we're going to consider of the church in this period is we're going to consider some important people and their writings. And then the third thing we're going to consider is daily life in the period of the later Christian Empire. Okay, are we ready for this? First of all, we're talking about this long period starting about 1000 AD and continuing on until the time of the Reformation. And what you have here in the middle of Europe, you have this thing called the Holy Roman Empire, which extends all the way up through modern-day modern-day Holland, all the way down to modern-day Italy in Eastern. This is about the greatest extent of what was called the Holy Roman Empire. It's not France, it's not England. These are major players, of course, but you have this mainly Germanic, but also Italian and Dutch and parts of France and such, this Holy Roman Empire. The other thing I want you to notice here is, please notice this, don't forget this in Europe at the time, 1000 AD, what's down here? Ladies and gentlemen, this is still Muslim. This is still Muslim down here. The Spanish Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, is still Muslim. Now, let's talk about some of the general trends and characteristics of the later Christian empire period. Number one, what we have is the struggle between the spiritual powers and the secular powers. Struggle between the spiritual powers and the secular powers. Now, through the early part of the Middle Ages, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, there was a growing partnership between the powers of the church, represented by the Pope, and the powers of kings. The leadership role of Gregory I was just the beginning in that, because the church was the most significant institution after the fall of the Roman Empire. The church had a very natural leadership role. And 2 weeks ago, we talked about the crowning of Charlemagne of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo II on Christmas Day in the year 800. This was more than just recognizing that he was the leading monarch in Europe. Not only, it was also recognizing that he was the best hope for the advancement of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, and it was an expression of the very delicate and sometimes contentious relationship between the popes and the kings. I spoke about this 2 weeks ago, but let me just give you that figure. You have here in this picture the idea of the Pope doing what to Charlemagne? What is he doing? Just look at the picture. He's putting a crown on his head. Now, first of all, doesn't that tell you something? That at least in that conception, the Pope is more powerful than the king. Because whoever has the right to put the crown on, what does he also have the right to do? Take the crown off. And so it's, look, I'm making it seem like you're a big deal, Charlemagne, by putting this crown on you, and you are a big deal, but don't ever forget, I'm the guy who put it on your head. I can put it on somebody else's head if I want to. But let me ask you this. Does anybody really think that kings back then or today feel like the Pope is more powerful than they are? That's not in the nature of kings. And so you have this constant struggle, who's more powerful, the Pope or the king? And as things developed, there was a constant tension between the emperor and the Pope. Who was really in charge? The Pope claimed authority over the emperors because he crowned him. The emperors usually felt more powerful than the popes did. It was a constant struggle, sometimes known as the investiture struggle. In the East, the kings won this battle, especially, for example, in Russia with the rise of the czars. In Islam, both religious and political offices were combined in the Sultanate. But in the West, popes and kings were always looking for an advantage over the other. Now, in the midst of that kind of political struggle, it shouldn't surprise us that the papacy became a highly political office and that it was often filled by very corrupt men. I mean, after all, if an office holds a lot of political power, is it not true that political people are going to go after it? So that's what happened in the office of the papacy. One of these popes was Pope John XII. He ruled from 955 to 963. He was charged by a council of bishops with almost every imaginable crime. He was said to have toasted the health of the devil, to have invoked the help of pagan gods to help him in his gambling. The whole council agreed that he was a very corrupt man, but what did Pope John XII say in response? He just simply replied, "If you want to set up another pope, by the power of Almighty God, I excommunicate you, so that you will not have the power to perform Mass or ordain anybody." You see, the Pope had the ultimate power, at least in the thinking of that age. The Pope held the power to excommunicate people, to send them to hell, and that was the power that ultimately, or at least that he could put forth. Pope Boniface VII, he came to office by strangling his predecessor in the year 974. He was described by a council of bishops as being a papal monster who in his abject depravity exceeds all mortals. Now, some of the popes weren't evil. They were just really political. A good example of that is Gregory the Seventh. Gregory the Seventh was also known as Hildebrand, and he was one of the three popes of the era that showed this great struggle between the popes and the kings. Hildebrand issued a very famous document titled Plenitudo Potestas, which declares that the pope is, listen carefully to these words, the pope is the vicar of Christ, not the vicar of Peter. And to this day, the pope claims as one of his titles, the vicar of Christ. Now, does anybody know the meaning of the title vicar? Vicar is still a title used in, like, the Anglican Church in England. They'll have the vicar if you watch English television shows. Well, Vicar Smith stopped by to have some tea, you know, or something like that. But does anybody know what the idea behind the word vicar is? Yes?
Isn't it like the earthly representation?
Okay, it's representative. We get our word vicarious from the same Latin root. Vicarious, vicar. Okay, has everybody got that? Now notice, the popes in the early centuries claimed, pretend I'm a pope, I'm not, but just pretend I am the vicar of Peter. What does that mean? I am Peter's representative. No, that's pretty high office. I mean, if Peter was preeminent among all the other apostles, then to say I am the vicar of Peter means I'm claiming a pretty high office. But check it out. You want to get even higher? Then just start claiming I am the vicar of Christ. I don't represent Peter on the earth. I am the earthly representation of Jesus Christ. That's the title that the popes claimed, beginning with Hildebrand and continuing to this day. Now, Pope Gregory's authority was severely tested in his battle with Henry IV. The argument was based on the important issue of appointments to church offices. You see, the emperor and the popes both claimed the right to appoint men to these politically and financially important offices. Just for example, there you are. One guy's the pope, another guy's the king, and the office of the Bishop of London becomes open. The Bishop of London dies. Who's going to be the next Bishop of London? Well, whoever has the power to appoint the next Bishop of London, he's got a lot of power for two reasons. Number one, if you put your guy in there, then he's going to look out for you and represent your interests. Okay? Number two, and this is how it went. We'll talk about this more in coming weeks, so hold on to your hat. But the way they did it back then was, if you wanted to be the Bishop of London, you had to pay the guy who was going to appoint you a big fee. Normally, you had to pay him your first year's income from being... That's kind of where the bidding started, and the bidding could go up from there. So it was politically important and it was financially important to have this power to appoint. Well, listen, when the Bishop of London's office became vacant, the Pope said, I'm the Pope. I can appoint the next Bishop of London. But what did the King of England say? I'm the king. I can appoint the next Bishop of London. Who's going to appoint the next bishop? This was a battle between the kings and the popes. Now, Gregory VII, Hildebrand, said that the emperors or the kings had no right to appoint anybody to an ecclesiastical office. King Henry, ignored the Pope's decrees, and Gregory summoned the emperor to Rome. Henry refused to come to the Pope, and he declared Gregory the Pope to be deposed. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry and declaring him deposed. You following along with this? Let's say John Blaubach, a good German guy there. Let's say Blaubach is King Henry IV there of the Holy Roman Empire. And King Henry the John over there, he says, well, I'm going to appoint a man to this empty bishop's office, and so I'm the Pope. And I say, no, John, you can't do that. And John says, well, no, I can do it. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I said, no, John, you come to Rome and you appear before me. We got to talk this out. You know, I'm going to come and give you an answer. John says, I'm not coming. Forget you. So what do? I say, I excommunicate you, King Henry. And what does John say back to me? He goes, well, I depose you. You're no longer the Pope. You see how it goes back and forth? Now, there's one other thing I got to tell you about this, is that it was a heavy thing for a pope to depose a king and declare him excommunicated. You know why? Because his subjects were no longer bound to obey him. You know what? Listen, I'll be straight with you. If Pope, forgive me, what's the present Pope's name? Francis? If Pope Francis were to say and issue a proclamation, David Guzik of Santa Barbara is excommunicated and I consign his soul to hell, I hate to tell you, I wouldn't lose 5 minutes sleep about it. Yeah. Who cares? I don't care. You know, what do I care? So why did Henry care about the Pope excommunicating him? Well, first of all, he cared because they really believed in the Pope's power, spiritually speaking, in a way I don't believe in Pope Francis's power. But there's another big reason. King Henry IV over the Holy Roman Empire, if it becomes publicly known that the Pope has excommunicated him, then nobody has to obey him in his kingdom. Nobody has to pay their taxes. Soldiers don't have to fight for him. You don't have to obey an excommunicated king. So this was a big deal, and it went back and forth. So this was a letter of Pope Gregory to King Henry. Ready for this letter? Bishop Gregory, servant of the servants of God, to King Henry, greeting and apostolic benediction. That is, if he be obedient to the apostolic chair, as is fitting for a Christian king. Since you do confess yourself to be a son of the church, it would have been fitting for your royal dignity to look more respectfully upon the master of the church, that is St. Peter, the chief of the apostles. That's just the beginning. Okay? Well, Henry wrote a letter back. You know, typed it out on his computer, sent send, and this was Henry's letter back. Are we at Henry's letter? Yeah, here's the reply. Henry, king, not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God, to Hildebrand, at present time, not pope, but false monk. Such greetings as this you have deserved through your disturbances, inasmuch as there is no area of the church which you have failed to make yourself a partaker, not of honor, but of confusion, not of blessing, but of curses. Whoa, whoa. All right, well, it's going on to his next page of his email. Thou, therefore, damned by this curse and by the judgment of all our bishops and by our own, descend and relinquish the apostolic chair which you have usurped. Let another ascend the throne of St. Peter, who shall not practice violence under the cover of religion, but shall teach sound doctrine of St. Peter. I, Henry, king, by the grace of God, do say unto thee, together with all our bishops, descend, descend, to be damned throughout the ages. And he hits send after typing that up. All right, so do you get a little feel between the contention between the popes and the kings? Yeah, there's a little time for the email. Now, in light of all this, how did it work out? Well, in light of it all, Pope Gregory forced King Henry to humbly submit in light of the disobedience to papal power. And submit he did. He traveled with his wife and child. They crossed the Alps in the middle of winter to come to the Pope's residence in Italy and humble himself at the Pope's feet. But Gregory would not receive Henry, and he made him wait outside the snow in the castle. Do you have this picture? Come on, wife. Come on, children. We're going to journey across the Alps. And this was a big deal. I mean, come on. They couldn't just get on a plane. They're traveling by horseback and by carriage and whatever they could do all across the Alps. They come to the Pope's house, and they go, and it's snowing. It's the middle of winter, and Henry, a king, knocking at somebody's door. Listen, when do kings knock at anybody's door? But see what he's doing? Gregory, let me in. I'm so sorry. It's cold outside. Let me in. For 3 days he waited outside, begging the Pope to let him come in and beg forgiveness. On the 4th day, Gregory relented and let him in. He restored him, and he repealed the excommunication of Emperor Henry over the Holy Roman Empire. And so he made a promise. Henry IV made a promise of obedience to the Pope. He said, being admonished to do so by the counsel of our faithful ones, I promise to observe in all things the obedience due to the Apostolic See and to thee, Pope Gregory, and will take care devoutly to correct and to render satisfaction for anything whereby a derogation to the honor of that see or to your honor has arisen through us. Okay, now here's the question. Here's the question. Why didn't the Pope open the door after a half hour and let him in? King Henry, I'm so happy that you're asking forgiveness. I am a pastor at heart. I want to restore a repentant brother. Why didn't he do that? Because he knew Henry didn't mean it. He knew it. On both sides, it was all for show. Henry basically said, you know what? I'll give everybody the show they want to see. I'll show them this kind of show of repentance. But I don't mean it. And Gregory knows I don't mean it. And I'm going to get his stamp of approval. And I'm going to go back to Germany. And I'm going to do whatever it is I want to do. Because I'm Emperor Henry IV over the Holy Roman Empire. 7 years later, Henry's armies marched into Rome and drove Pope Gregory VII into exile. That's how really repentant he was. Overall, through this period, kings became more and more powerful over the popes. And despite being humbled by the kings, the popes claimed great power and tried to express that power through their papal decrees. The spiritual and political power that they claimed for themselves was staggering. This is from a decree of Pope Gregory VII, the same Pope Gregory, March the 7th, the year 1080. Ready for this? These are his claims. Number 1, whoops, I think I missed one. That the Roman Church was founded by God alone. That the Roman Pontiff alone can rightly be called universal. That he alone can depose or reinstate bishops. That among other things, we ought not to remain in the same house as with those excommunicated by him. Did I go on the right one? That he alone may use the imperial insignia. That of the Pope alone all princes shall kiss the feet. That his name alone shall be spoken in the churches. That this is the only name in the world. That it may be permitted to him to depose emperors. That no chapter and no book shall be considered canonical without his authority. That he himself may be judged by no one. That the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, the Scripture bearing witness. That the Roman Pontiff, if he have been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter. That he may depose and reinstate bishops without assembling a synod. That he who is not at peace with the Roman Church shall not be considered Catholic, that he may absolve subjects from their obligation to wicked men. This was after Henry played him so bad. Do you understand what this is? You know, when a guy has to go around and saying, listen, I got to tell you guys, I'm in charge of this class. I'm in charge of this class. Hey, I can dock your grade. I'm in charge of this class. The more a guy talks like that, what does it mean? The less he's in charge of the class. The more his power is slipping away. And as the power of the popes started to fade more and more, now it was still big. Nobody get this wrong. The power of the popes was still massive. But the balance of power was shifting from the popes over to the kings. A following pope, Innocent III, this is 1198 to 1216, he was the second of the 3 popes most significant in the struggle between the popes and the kings. Innocent III set the theme for his papacy by reading Jeremiah 1:10. This is what he said when he came to the papal office. See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. I of all power. Again, there's a little bit of that I'm in charge here going on. But more than any other pope before or since, Innocent III controlled both church and state. And he presided over the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215. And at that council, Pope Innocent III declared, he commanded crusades, he defined the seven sacraments, he defined and confirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation, he made confession to a priest and penance necessary for salvation, and he denounced the recently written Magna Carta of England, which gave the nobles some rights against the kings. Now please notice this. The seven sacraments were not defined officially until this date. Transubstantiation as a doctrine was not defined officially before this date. The requirements of confession and penance before a priest were not officially required before this date. Now, please know, those things were all around for centuries before this, but this is when they were officially codified and a stamp of approval put upon them at the Fourth Lateran Conference in 1215. And then the third pope that we're going to consider in this period, a man named Boniface VIII. He was the third of these popes from 1294 to 1303. And he issued the papal bull Unum Sanctum, 1302, in response to his struggles with King Philip of France. Now, before we talk about Unum Sanctum, a couple of things. Notice this. The classic papal crown is a triple crown. You see that? That's two crowns and then something on top there. The Pope has a triple crown because he rules over the church, over the state, and over the culture. The triple crown of the Pope. Isn't that kind of a freaky thing? More than one crown? It's very deliberate. There's no mistaking this. I rule the church and I rule the state. That's what that multiple crown tried to say. Now, we're going to talk about a papal bull. When we talk about a papal bull, nobody should be thinking of an animal. Okay, forget about the animal. In Latin, bulla is a seal. So if a document was sealed like this, with this seal at the bottom, there or there, it was a bull. So a papal bull is an official document. Okay, has everybody got that straight? This official document of the Pope, called Unum Sanctum, this is what it said. There is one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, outside of which there is neither salvation nor remission of sins. Let that sink down. One holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, outside of which there is neither salvation nor remission of sins. Now, is this today the official doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church? Yes, it certainly is. There is a difference, though, and that is an important difference. Okay, here's the difference. Today, Roman Catholic, and I think this comes even down from the popes, they say, yes, but you can be a part of the Roman Catholic Church and not know it. So a Roman Catholic wouldn't necessarily say to me, hey, David Guzik, you don't go to Mass, you don't participate in the sacraments, you don't attend the Roman Catholic Church, you're not a member of the Roman Catholic Church, you're damned to hell because there's no salvation outside of our church. What they may say is they may say, well, David, you are part of the Roman Catholic Church, you just don't know it. Okay? But do they still believe that there is no salvation outside the Roman Catholic Church? Yes. Yes, they still believe this. It's important to understand that this idea comes from something very much older in the church. Here's the statement, okay? I'm going to say a statement, and I want you to think about the statement, and then I'm going to ask for a show of hands. But everybody has to choose yes or no, okay? I don't care about right or wrong. I just want you to think about, I just want to know that you thought about it. You got to choose yes or no. So here's the statement. Ready? No one can have God for their father without having the church for their mother. I'll repeat that statement. No one can have God as their father without having the church as their mother. I'm going to give you a moment to think about that. Okay, with that statement, just as I said it, raise your hand if you agree with that and you say yes to that statement. Well, thank you. At least there's two in the room. And so, am I to say, raise your hand if you disagree with that statement? Oh, I'm going to go with the minority here. I believe you cannot have God as your father and not have the church as your mother. The two go together. Now, somebody muttered the right question there. Which church? Which church? That is the question, isn't it? So we would agree with that proposition, or I would agree with it, if you properly define church. And I would define church as what is classically called in Christian theology, the church invisible. The spiritual body of Christ that accompanies generations past, generations to come, the global church of those who are truly united by being one in the Spirit and who are born again. Now, if you are going to point to any institutional church and say that of any institutional church, I would disagree, and I would be with all those who raise their hands to say no. So it all depends on how you define church. Now let me ask you this. If you were to ask Mr. Boniface, Pope Boniface, how do you define church? He'd slap you in the face. What are you talking about? He goes, the church I'm the Pope over. And outside of that church, there's no salvation. So let me discuss some other points of unum sanctum. They said both the spiritual and temporal swords belong to the Pope as the vicar of God. The spiritual sword answers to God alone. The Pope is beyond judgment on this earth. But the temporal sword operates under papal authority. And then thirdly, salvation is only possible when a person is submitted to the Pope. So unum sanctum was issued because Pope Boniface was having an argument with Philip of France. So what did Philip of France do? Well, he did what they all did. He questioned Boniface's legitimacy on the papal throne, and he ordered him arrested and put on trial. So what did Boniface do? Boniface ran for his life, but he died in his effort to flee from Philip. Now you see this? This is a classic case here. Unum sanctum lays it all out. It's beating his chest. I'm in charge of this class. But he ended up having to run because the class was in a riot against him. That was the whole thinking there. It was said, and this is kind of an interesting saying, because he died running for his life, it was said that Boniface ruled like a lion, but died like a dog. So what about Boniface's successor, Clement V? Well, he tried to appease the kings that he struggled with. He even moved the papacy to the French-ruled city of Avignon to please Philip. This was known as the Babylonian captivity of the church, when the popes ruled from Avignon from 1305 to 1377. When the Pope returned to Rome, things got worse because the French king and the rulers wanted him to stay in France. By this time, the office of the Pope was so much under the power of the kings that Philip, the king of France, could say, oh yeah, you want to keep having this little Pope thing going on? Then move it to France. And for some 65 years, the Pope ruled from France. Did I say 65 years? It was really more like 72 years. Now, the controversy caused by this sort of surrender, I mean, after all, let's say this. If you're a Frenchman, and now the Pope is in the pocket of the French king, how do you feel about it? Woo! Yeah, vive la France! If you're an Englishman, how do you feel about it? You're like, this is bad news, because the Pope is in the pocket of my enemy. This eventually led to what was known as the Great Schism, where opposing parties supported different popes. At times, there were 3 supposed legitimate popes or bishops of Rome. And the consular movement tried to solve the problem. So there was a Roman faction. They supported a guy named Urban VI. That included the German Emperor, England, Hungary, and Scandinavia. Then the Avignon faction supported Clement VII, France, Naples, Scotland, Spain, and Sicily. They all gathered together and supported. You see, so now it's like superpowers uniting and each one having their supposed pope. The Great Schism lasted for 40 years following the move of the papal headquarters from Rome to Avignon. Different political factions, backed by the kings of different nations, recognized 2 or 3 different popes at the same time, and what did they do? Well, they all tried to excommunicate each other. So you had the Roman faction, you had the Avignon faction, then you had a third line suggested to eliminate the 2 competitors. So at one time, at the same time, there were 3 different supposed popes of the Roman Catholic Church. Finally, the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, ended the controversy by deposing all 3 popes and electing Martin V. The Council of Constance also tried to assert the authority of councils over the Pope and tried to establish a regular interval for the meetings of the councils. But its ruling was pretty much ignored by the popes, and they were still in charge over the church. Let me explain something about the councils. Do you have a question?
Was that an aim of the council, or was it an effect of the council?
What's that? The schism?
That they tried to assert the authority of the popes.
This was a movement within the church at this time, the consular movement. So I'll explain. You're familiar with the idea of a church council. We have the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of this. Today we talked about the Fourth Lateran Council. There have been times when the church has come together and said, we got a big problem, let's call together a council and work it out. Now, by the way, the last really significant council that was held was the Vatican II in the 1960s and 70s, wasn't that in? Yeah, and it really did some radical things in the Roman Catholic Church. It would be fascinating to think if there could be a true church council today. It's impossible. But think about what that would be like. If you could actually get together true representatives from the Christian world, I mean, people who are really born again in whatever movements, and bring them together for a church council to work through certain issues. Yes? Maybe, but even that was just an idea of in America. A big part of these true church councils is they're totally international. Okay, but beyond all that, the idea was that those who supported what's called the consular movement, they said, look, the popes are fine for the day-to-day operations of the church, but there are times when you got to call in a council, and here's the tricky point. They said the councils have more authority than the popes. Okay? You call together the Nicene Council, that's more authority than the Bishop of Rome. You call together the Council of Chalcedon, that has more authority than the Bishop of Rome. So, when you had 3 competing popes, what did they do? They called together the Council of Constance, and at the Council of Constance, they said, you 3, you're out, Martin V, you're up, you're the real pope, 1 pope now, but, let's have these councils on a regular basis just to keep the popes in line. I don't know, every 20 years, I don't know what they proposed, whatever it was. So what did Martin V do as soon as he became pope? Forget you, councils. I'm the Pope. So the councilor movement arose because of the frustration with the popes coming from the political nature of the office, but the councilor movement was never able to really establish itself against the popes. Yes? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. With a name like Martin, I'm going to suppose it's Germany, but I don't know. What that comes from is Protestants don't like to take the title Protestant. So in lieu of that, they're saying Christian in lieu of Protestant. Yes. That really just explains it. Yeah. Because you think about it, we don't go around pretty much saying, I'm Protestant. You know, I mean, it's not like you would refuse to say, but it's not just normally how we present ourselves. So yeah, that's where that flows from. Yes, John?
Is that why Protestants in Germany are called evangelicals?
Yes, but that comes back to just gospel preachers. But that goes all the way back to Luther. Yeah. Okay, now, think about this. In the 40 years of the Great Schism, if you were a common Christian living in a village in Germany or France, you may very well not even know that it was going on. You didn't even know. Who would tell you? You were isolated. Your village priest probably did not know it was happening. And the archbishop wouldn't want to tell him. So, a lot of this were arguments among the aristocrats. On a normal parish, if you want to say that level, village level, who cares? So we always got to separate in our mind between what's going on in the upper levels among the movers and shakers and the lives of the common people. So I find that a fascinating observation. But the Great Schism made certain things more clear than ever before, or clearer, I should probably say more properly. Number one, it made clear the political nature of the office of Pope. This was pure politics. That's it. That's all it was. It was a political office. Number two, it really exposed the corruption of the papal office. And then number three, it confirmed the strength of the popes over councils and sometimes kings. Nobody thought after this that the pope had more power, that a council had power over a pope. No. Everybody. No. So, in all of this, what's happening all throughout this period? And again, I don't want to act like it started in this period, but it solidified in a way in this period that was unbelievably hard, okay? This simple principle. The church becomes more important than Jesus. In the minds of the common people and in many of the leaders, salvation comes from the church. Salvation doesn't come from Jesus. I mean, that's really the whole conception. How are you saved, and how do you know that you are saved? Because you are in right relation to the church. What about being in right relation with Jesus? They would just say, well, if I am in right relation with the church, I am in right relation with Jesus. That was their simple thinking. But the church became more important than Jesus himself. You see, the Roman Catholic Church developed a neat theological package based on the idea that salvation was by the grace of God alone. Ladies and gentlemen, nobody should miss that. In Roman Catholic theology of this period, salvation is by the grace of God alone. That's not the issue. The issue is this: how is grace made available? And the Roman Catholic answer is this: Grace is made available by the sacraments that the church dispenses. Oh, salvation's totally by grace. And if you want grace, you got to come and receive the sacraments by a duly ordained minister of the Roman Catholic Church. That's how you receive grace. So you see how that thinking is? For you and I, and I'll just say it, I don't hope to offend anybody by this, but I'll just say it, but you and I, as more biblically thinking Christians, we're like, what, are you kidding? But that's exactly what's the thinking. Oh no, salvation's by grace. And I got to go to Mass to get my grace. I got to receive communion to get my grace. I got to do confession to get my grace. The idea of receiving grace from Jesus personally was totally foreign to them. Now, if grace can only be received through the church, then this might make some sense. But if it is possible for the believer to receive grace directly from Jesus himself, then the whole Roman Catholic system makes no sense at all, even though it's very pleasing to the flesh, to human nature. Why? Because you know if you got grace. If I receive communion, I get grace. If I go to confession, I get grace. If I attend Mass, I get grace. If I have, holy matrimony, I get grace. Blah, 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 blah. It's a very neat package, and that's was the dominant thinking in Europe. Yes?
In the Eastern Church, then, do you get grace from looking at the icons? Is that
You know what? I don't want to speak of things which I do not know, but that's a good... I think they would say you have relationship in and through the icons, but I don't know if they would say you get grace. That's a good question. I can't answer that. John?
It's easy to be in that position when the average person didn't read, didn't write, undereducated, and you only had one opinion telling you what is.
Yeah. Well, made it a lot easier. They couldn't conceive of anything different. Okay, so we've talked about this battle between the popes and kings during this period. Okay, can we go into a second general trend or event in this period? Here we go. Second general trend or event, the Crusades. The church becomes very militant. From the year 1096 to 1248, so you're talking about approximately 150 years, there were actually 7 different crusades, each with the supposed goal of protecting pilgrims and recapturing the Holy Land from the Muslims, or in weakening Islamic influence in that part of the world. I'll repeat this a few times, but I don't mind saying it at the front. There is a huge misconception about the Crusades. The Crusades in Europe at that time, they were totally perceived, right or wrong, and I think there was mostly wrong in the Crusades, but they were perceived not as an offensive war. Let's go back and take back the Holy Land. Let's conquer it for Jesus. It was a defensive. They came initially simply to protect pilgrims who wanted to go visit the Holy Land. That was the number one thing. Well, let me explain. It started with a man named Peter the Hermit. It sounds like a 60s group from England, doesn't it? Peter the Hermit. Peter had been on a pilgrimage to Palestine and experienced cruel treatment from the Muslims. And he decided to use his influence to stir up Christians against the Muslims. He got an audience with Pope Urban II, and the Pope approved the First Crusade. A crusade is a war on behalf of the cross, most literally speaking. Peter got on his donkey and traveled from city to city throughout Italy and France, stirring up the passion for the war. By the year 1095, Pope Urban II gave an impassioned appeal for an army to march to the Holy Land and win it back. Quote, "A horrible tale has gone forth. An accursed race, utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of the Christians and depopulated them by the sword, plundering and fire. Tear that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourself." After he said that, the crowd was so fired up that the people shouted in response, Deus vult, Deus vult, Deus vult, which means God wills it, God wills it, God wills it. Now, how do you motivate people to go fight in a crusade? Well, you do two things. First of all, you promise them money. And in those days, mostly, if you were going to fight in a war, your money came from what you could capture in battle. I'm not saying that you weren't paid anything, but you weren't paid anything to really make it worth it. You might be paid a survival wage on the war. No, what made it worth it was the plunder, the booty that you'd get. So there was that, number one. But number two, Pope Urban II promised that fighting in the Crusades would earn you time off purgatory. What is purgatory? You're going to have to wait and see until a later lecture. But Urban II promised, fighting in the Crusades, you get time off purgatory. Now, were the Crusades successful? Well, only in a limited sense. Crusaders did rule Jerusalem and other notable cities, but those areas eventually fell to Islam again. So the Crusades were never terribly successful. At the height of their success in 1100, you had the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, and then this right here. That's it. That's about it. All the rest of this is Muslim. It's Islamic. That's it. This is the height of success, just about. Most people believe, most historians believe, that the Crusades only succeeded this much because the Muslims didn't really care very much about that part of the world. As soon as they did care and say, look, let's get these guys out, they drove them out pretty easily. The two biggest misconceptions about the Crusades are, you can see again later on in 1200, they're just controlling this very narrow strip, and then this in Antioch. The two biggest misconceptions about the Crusades are, number one, that the Crusades were an offensive war against a peaceful Muslim Middle East. Listen, that's what modern-day Muslims want you to believe. Hey, we were just there doing our own thing and treating everybody great, and those nasty European Christians came and conducted a crusade against us. That's not how it was. They were defensive wars in direct reaction to Muslim aggression. And number two, the idea that the purpose of the Crusades was to expand Christianity. That is a misconception. The purpose of the Crusades was not to expand Christianity. That had nothing to do with it. But the Crusades got super weird. Super weird. There was... Oh, come on. Don't do this to me. There were the things called the Children's Crusades. There were two of them, actually, in the early 1200s. One of them started when a 12-year-old boy named Stephen of Cloyes inspired some 30,000 children to march to the Holy Land to make a spiritually powerful, supernatural conquest by the pure in heart. That's what they thought. This is a spiritual battle. We'll take children who are pure in heart. We'll march 30,000 of them to the Holy Land, and the Muslims won't be able to stand in front of them because God will be with them. Well, many of them died on the way. Others lost faith when the sea did not part for them. And most of the remaining children died at sea, were slaughtered, or were sold into slavery. Then, in the spring and summer of 1212, two separate, yet... Anyway, they gathered together for these children's crusades, and they tried to migrate. Despite their sincerity, the French and the German children suffered terribly, terribly. And these were just unbelievably foolish miscalculations. Okay, questions about the Crusades? They were obviously a big deal in this period. All right, let's move on to our next idea here. The establishment of the Inquisition, using violence to preserve the truth. In the year 1184, Pope Lucius III was concerned about heresy, and he required all bishops to inquire into the beliefs of their people. If a man was found guilty of heresy, he was excommunicated. Now, it was hoped that he would confess his heresy, retract it, and return to the church and the church's beliefs. At the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III provided for the state's punishing of heretics and the confiscation of their property. And if the state's police didn't fulfill the role, then the church would do it themselves. At the Synod of Toulouse in 1229, Pope Gregory IX was even more concerned about the rise of heresy. So they forbade lay people to possess the scriptures. They began a systematic attack on what was thought heresy. The investigators and the prosecutors were Dominican friars, leaders of a monastic movement that answered directly to the Pope. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV authorized torture as a means of gathering information or confessions from supposed heretics. The church would torture but not execute, so for executions, they declared those guilty over to the state for execution. Now, you got to understand something about this. The Inquisition was only targeted against those who claimed to be Christians. Many Jewish people suffered terribly under the Inquisition, but those were Jewish people who probably made false conversions under the threat of death or persecution. But then once you claimed to be a Christian, the Inquisition claimed authority over you. And at times and places, it was terrible. You see, the disgraceful justification of torture went all the way back to Augustine. Augustine argued that the phrase in Luke chapter 14, compel them to come in. That phrase about the wedding feast, it's a feast used in a parable. He said that compelled or justified compelling people to do what was right and good spiritually. Now, can you imagine that? One line from a parable being used as a justification to torture people in the name of Jesus. In 1478, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain asked the Pope for authority to establish the Inquisition in Spain. In Spain, there were many Jews and Muslims who had made half-hearted conversions to Christianity. And in 1492, they expelled all the Jews and Muslims from Spain, but the half-hearted converts still remained. The Inquisitor General of Spain was a man named Thomas de Torquemada, a Dominican friar. His campaign of torture, confiscation, reward for informants, and execution, it became infamous. And it was horrible what was carried out among these people in Spain. Now, the Inquisition was an inexcusable, sinful use of the church's power and authority. Inexcusable. The idea that you would torture somebody or commit violence against people in the name of Jesus, it's absolutely nuts. But this is what's usually misunderstood about the Crusades. Most people misunderstand the scope and the focus of the Crusades. Many, or perhaps most, of the people who were tortured and killed under the Inquisition were simply Bible-believing Christians who were not part of the institutional church and didn't want to be part of the institutional church. That's number one. Number two, the most tragic persecution of the Inquisition was against Jewish people who made a show of conversion to Christianity to save their life. But then they were persecuted for continuing Jewish practices and beliefs. But even at their worst, the Inquisition was responsible for the death of perhaps 250,000 people over several hundred years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is 250,000 people over several hundred years horrible? You better believe. It's awful. It's a blight upon the church. It's something to be repented of. We marvel at how the church became so corrupt, at how the church became so stupid to do such a thing. But again, I would just ask for some perspective. Modern secular people today, they like to point at the Inquisition as being evidence of the church. Okay, well, great. Let's just compare the Inquisition, which was horrible. Nobody's defending the Inquisition. But compare the Inquisition to the atheistic or anti-Christian regimes of the 20th century. Compare maybe 250,000 people over 200 years to what happened under Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, and many similar smaller figures. Compare that, and there's no comparison whatsoever. I guess what I'm just trying to say is that, listen, there are shameful episodes in the church. No doubt we shouldn't defend them. They should be repented of, and with great sorrow in our heart should we regard that legacy. But the worst of the church doesn't compare to modern atheism and secularism at all. Let's just remember that. You could say that those regimes I just listed, conservatively, between Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, and the smaller figures, conservatively, those guys are responsible for 100 million deaths in just a few decades. Not 250,000 over 200 years. So, any questions about the Inquisition? All right, next, the Mongol invasion. I think this is the fourth and final thing that we're talking about, as far as general trends and characteristics. In 1242, the most fearsome army ever to invade Europe turned back east after easily conquering almost all of Eastern Europe in 1241 and setting its sights all the way to the Atlantic. I wish I had a better map here. I wish I had that map of Europe that I had before. But picture an army from the east sweeping across all of Eastern Europe and coming up to, well, the gates of Vienna, actually. Coming up to that point in the year 1242. And not only did they conquer everything east of Europe to there, but they conquered it easily. Easily. This was a fearsome, dominating army that destroyed everything in its path, and it had its sights on sweeping over all of Western Europe and continuing right onto the Atlantic Ocean. Well, what happened? Well, let me just say this. The Dark Ages, that's what we normally call the early period of the Christian Empire. Up to about the year 1000, we often call it the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were pure light compared to what could have happened if the Mongols would have overran the rest of Europe. You see, as 1242, Mongol scouts had probed as far as Vienna. That was the next major city on their agenda. And there was really no way for any European army to stop them. These horse warriors from the central steppes of Asia had special composite bows that were superior to any technology in Europe. And they fought surprisingly like a modern army with its tactics and its strategies, but they did so in the medieval world. The only two armies in Europe capable of stopping them had been beaten in the year before, in April of 1241. Those two battles happened within a day of each other, but long distances apart. On April 9th, 1241, a large army of Germans, Poles, Templar, and Teutonic Knights marched out of Liegnitz to a slightly smaller force of Mongols on the flat fields of northern Poland. They were totally defeated by the Mongols. Then on April 10th, in Bela, Bela is a Hungarian king on the city of Buda. He went out against the advancing Mongol army and with clever and bold tactics, Sabotai, the Mongol warrior, won the battle and killed almost the entire army of King Bela, who escaped, but he didn't stop running until he made it to an island in the Adriatic. For the rest of 1241, the Mongol armies rested and prepared to attack again in 1242, ready to push into a weak and fragmented Europe. No Christian army had stopped the Mongols to that point or even slowed them down. Listen, 1242 was a horrible year. It looked like it was going to be the Mongol invasion. Now, Genghis Khan was not on this campaign, but his amazing military and political leadership made its mark on the army, which had conquered much of China and then started westward towards and into Europe. Their method of warfare was basically calculated massacre. When a city resisted him, it eventually fell, and all the cities fell before these Mongol armies. He had all of the inhabitants slaughtered. That's it. You just kill everybody. In 1220, it was said that Genghis Khan and his armies killed 1.6 million people at Herat. And when it was told the commander that some had survived by hiding among the corpses, at the next battle at Nishapur, he commanded that all the heads be removed from every corpse. At Nippur, it is said that the Mongol armies killed 1.7 million people in that massacre. They attacked Russia and destroyed cities and killed hundreds of thousands of people. That Mongol invasion was something that I don't know if the world has ever seen such an army like that before. When the Mongols conquered a city, they destroyed it completely. They were rural people. These were horse people. They hated cities. So what did they do? They just destroyed them. They didn't inhabit them. They didn't occupy them. They just killed and destroyed everywhere that they went. The population of China declined more than 30% during the years of the Mongol conquest. The Mongols reduced the once thriving city of Kiev to a city of about 100 people, of blacked out ruins. When the Mongols came to a city, the inhabitants of the city were given the opportunity to surrender. If they did, they could leave the city while it was plundered and destroyed, and many of the children, young men, and women were taken as slaves. But those who remained would be scattered into the countryside because the Mongols hated cities. Now, as they approached Vienna, it seemed like there was nothing that could stop them. And they would likely destroy everything in their path and spread out over all of Western Europe until the Atlantic. Then they would have an empire that stretched across 2 continents, from the Pacific in Asia to the Atlantic. I mean, that's unbelievable. Well, what happened? You could say that the death of one man changed everything. What was that one man? Well, the man was Ugadai Khan, the leader of the Mongols and the son of Genghis Khan. He had kept his father's empire alive and had even expanded it. When this Khan died, the law required that the tribal leaders go back to their homeland and elect a new Khan. That's why the Mongol armies retreated from Europe. Even when Vienna was in their sights and the rest of Europe was usually laid bare before them. Their Khan died. They had to go back according to tribal law and re-elect another one, and they never regained the momentum to push westward again. Ladies and gentlemen, the death of that one man changed everything. If that man would have lived another 5 years, the history of Europe would have been, if he would have lived another 1 year, the history of Europe would have been remarkably, remarkably different. In some ways, you can see God's hand upon history. God knew. It's amazing that at certain times and places, we can so plainly see history turning on a single point. It's fascinating to me. All right, those are the four major trends and events that I want to talk about in this period. The competition between kings and popes. What was the second? The Crusades. The third was the Inquisition. And the fourth was the Mongol invasion. Okay? Now let's talk about some important people and writings of this period. We'll just talk about a few. I think I have listed 3 people, which is nothing, right? I mean, 3 people out of 500 years. But just a few people. First of all, Anselm. Anselm wrote many famous works. One of them was called Why God Became Man. He developed the idea of the ontological argument for God's existence. What is that? It's the idea that there must be a supreme being. Why is there a God? There has to be. There must be one. Here's an example of Anselm's writings. Ready? So truly, therefore, you do exist, O Lord my God, that your non-exist is inconceivable, and with good reason. For if a man's mind could conceive something better than you, the creature would rise above the Creator and judge him, which is utterly absurd. So God has to exist because there has to be something greater than what we can conceive. That's Anselm, a very important theologian of this period. Another one, Thomas Aquinas. One of his greatest works was Summa Theologica. You might call him the Babe Ruth of scholasticism. Sorry for those who don't know Babe Ruth is. Babe Ruth is generally regarded as the most famous baseball player to ever live. Babe Ruth, so Thomas Aquinas, man, he was a producer. He put out unbelievable amounts of work. Babe Ruth hit home runs. Thomas Aquinas wrote theology. His philosophical system, known as Thomism, is still influential today. So here's an example of Aquinas. I reply that man was bound through sin in 2 respects. First, in servitude to sin. The devil, by inducing man to sin, had overcome him, and therefore man was assigned to the devil as a slave. Secondly, in respect to the incurring of a penalty, according to the justice of God, therefore, since the passion of Christ was sufficient and superabundant for the sin of the human race, and the penalty incurred, his passion was a kind of ransom by which we were freed from both these obligations. Again, very much think about the legal technicalities of what Jesus did for us on the cross. And so for the third figure that I want to talk about this figure, I want to talk about a guy who's not so much famous as a theologian, but simply as a Christian, Francis of Assisi. This man had a fascinating life. As a young man, he was, over time, converted from a hedonistic lifestyle. So he gave up his future career that was to follow his father as a successful businessman, and he started spending his days meditating on the Lord in an old abandoned church, and he felt God drawing him to be there. So he started he started reaching out to the poor and to lepers. And after a pilgrimage to Rome, he felt God telling him to rebuild an old abandoned church. So he sold whatever he had. He gave the money to a priest to start the work, and he also sold some of his father's merchandise. When his father found out, he was so angry that he had Francis arrested. His father demanded full payment. So what did Francis do? He gave his father the very clothes off his back right then and there. When he walked away naked, nobody could deny that he gave everything for the sake of the gospel. So he eventually started traveling around preaching, living simply by faith, and soon there were a lot of people who wanted to imitate his example of a radical commitment to Jesus. He and his followers would go out 2 by 2 preaching the gospel and helping the poor peasants in their fields. Francis and his followers challenged the conscience of their generation, and they had to pay a price for it. They were constantly the objects of scorn and attack. People often said that he was insane to give away everything and to live as a poor man for God. He and his followers were often pelted with mud. They were insulted, and they often had their humble rags torn off their backs. But Francis always distinguished himself by always bearing such attacks and accusations with good nature and with gentleness. After a while, Francis and 11 of his followers went to Rome to see the Pope. They wanted his approval of their mission of poverty and preaching, and while Pope Innocent III, remember him, gave his blessing upon their movement. Later, in 1212, they sought the Pope's permission to organize as an officially recognized monastic order. They were to be dedicated to the life of simplicity, and they called themselves the Friars Minor, which kind of means the little brothers. That was the beginning of the Franciscan monks. And the followers of Francis were monks, but not the type who went away to the desert or shut themselves up in the monastic walls. They were always out ministering to all sorts of people, preaching the gospel and helping the poor and the needy. He had a passion to preach the gospel to the lost. Francis started evangelical missions to Syria and to Morocco. He was unable to complete them because of illness or adverse circumstances, but in 1219 he traveled to Egypt to convert the Sultan Kamil. But the Muslim leader never responded to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Francis also tried to go to the Holy Land, but he was thwarted by shipwreck. The evangelistic zeal of Franciscans would continue after Francis's death, and some of Francis's followers later went as far as China to preach the gospel. But, all that being said, the last years of his life were pretty sad. With the continued growth of his movement, Francis asked Pope Honorius to appoint a particular cardinal as the protector of the order, and changes were made in the rule that governed the order of Francis, changes that turned out for the worse. In the same year that the new rule of order was approved, Francis resigned from his own movement. Think about that. Francis of Assisi did not die as a Franciscan. He resigned from his own movement because it had already corrupted in his own day. He died in 1226 when he was just 44 years old. When his body was examined for burial, people noticed curious red scars on his hands, feet, and side. These are traditionally referred to as stigmata, mystic replicas of Christ's wounds, but they were never confirmed during his lifetime. They were certainly there when he died, but there was nothing to indicate that they were miraculous in origin. They just noted these strange marks on his body after he died. Maybe the best way to look at the life of Francis of Assisi is to look about a famous prayer he wrote. Do you know this prayer of St. Francis? It's a pretty good prayer. Come on, you. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there's sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, not so much to be understood as to understand, not so much to be loved as to love, for it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we awaken to eternal life. It's a pretty good prayer. All right, our last section for today's lecture, daily life in the early Christian period. What was it like to be a Christian just in Europe during this time? Well, life was hard. It wasn't as hard as what we talked about last time, the early period of the Christian empire. That early period, from about 500 to 1000, is often referred to as the Dark Ages. The later period is often referred to as the High Middle Ages. And through this second period of the Christian empire, there was a slow, consistent development of trade and a merchant class. The Hanseatic League was an important example of this development, and prominent families began to rise that weren't nobility, but successful merchants and bankers. Another characteristic of life during this period, people really believed in heaven and hell. They really believed in it. In a way, bless you, that we don't know of in our present culture. Let me give you an illustration of that. Back then, armies were basically for hire. When you were a king or a duke or something like that and you needed an army, you hired a bunch of, cutthroats and, mercenaries and weirdos to fight for you. When these guys weren't hired, they were basically freelance armies that went out and did their thing. I've read all about this in a book called A Distant Mirror. It's by a woman named Barbara Tuchman, and she writes about Europe in the 14th centuries, during the 1300s. So she describes what it was like, and this is what she describes in this book. How there's records of these freelance armies going up to cities or a monastic, compound or something like that, and they basically say this. They park outside the city or the village or the monastic compound. And they go, look, here's the deal. You give us, let's just say, $100,000 and, food for all our men. Give us that, or we're going to come in and destroy your city, burn down all your houses, rape all your women, and murder a bunch of you. That's your choice. Either one or the other. What are you going to do? So what would the cities do? Or what would the monastic centers do? Well, they would come out and they'd negotiate. 100,000. Man, that's pretty high. How about 25? And they'd go back and forth and they negotiate a price. Food for all your men? Look, how about, half your men? That kind of thing. They would negotiate and they'd come to think, okay, well, we won't do it. So, and if they didn't come to agreement, they'd destroy the city. If they did come to agreement, okay, fine, we paid you off. Now, here's the deal. They have the actual written records of some of these negotiations, some of the contracts that they'd signed. And so in this book, A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, she describes the discovery of one of these ancient contracts between a group of these murderers and a monastic community. And this is what the murderers, rapists, arsonists want. They say, okay, we want this much money, we want this much supplies, we want this much food, we want this much wine, and we want a letter for every man in our group from the monks absolving them from sin and guaranteeing that they go to heaven. And I'm like, oh, okay, good, we'll do that. And to think that these guys who made their living as murderers, rapists, arsonists, and thieves, that they went to bed at night thinking, man, I got to get that letter so I go to heaven. What it shows, as well as a very faulty system of salvation, but what it shows, these guys really believed in heaven and hell. And it's very hard for us to relate to that in our world today. People just don't. But the whole world of medieval and Reformation Europe makes a lot more sense if you just get it in your mind. You're dealing with a culture that really believes in heaven and hell. Okay, next. There was a great surrender of the ego or the I. Do you want to know tremendous examples of this? The Canterbury Cathedral took 23 generations to build. 23 generations! And we don't even know the names of the architects or the builders. And that was common. That was typical. I'm not going to say we don't know the names of the architects or builders of any of these great cathedrals or monuments, but many of them, we don't have any idea whatsoever. Why? Well, because you lived in a culture where noblemen had last names. A nobleman might be David Guzik, something like that, a last name. Common people, you just had a surname. That's it. Or maybe you'd be known as the son of somebody. That's all. The simple idea was that you were a nobody, and in a good sense, it was all to the glory of God. Next, there was very little awareness of time. We're very aware of time. We got our watches, we got our calendars, we got our years, we know this, we know that. They didn't live with the same awareness of time that we do, in the sense of knowing what century you were in. And there was pretty good reason for this. Things changed very little. Okay, think about right now, 2016. Think how different the world was 200 years ago in 1816. What a difference in the world. But look, those who are just my age, you know how different the world was just 50 years ago. 200 years ago, the world was radically different. Okay, now, you take the year 1300 and go back to 1100, not a lot of difference. Some. There were a few things invented, there were a few new technologies, but you know what? Life was basically the same in 1300 as in 1100. So, you know, you don't mark things the same way. You want to know one example of what life was like back then? There was so little urbanization, and Europe was still so wild with forests that, and I think I got this from the Barbara Tuchman book again, you could walk from Poland to France, walking for 2 months and never see the sun because you were under constant forest. Now, that might be a small exaggeration, but pretty much. That's how not clear the land was, even up to this time in Europe. But as much as anything, the church dominated life. The church was the wealthiest landowner in Europe. To eat a meal during Lent, to eat meat during Lent was a death penalty crime. To go against the authority of the church meant certain hell. The doctrine was simple. Nulla salus extra ecclesiam. Outside the church, there is no salvation. That was a simple thing. This was first promoted way back by Cyprian in the 3rd century, but it was believed by almost everyone and explicitly reaffirmed in the 5th Lateran Council. During this period, if you were a common everyday Christian, almost certainly you were illiterate. But they did learn something of the Bible through illuminated manuscripts, through dramas, mystery plays, morality plays, miracle plays, and by works of art like stained glass, paintings, mosaics, and sculptures. Priests in that time would take vows of celibacy, but many of them had concubines. And the practice was often open and accepted, as long as the priest was faithful to that one woman. One chronicler tells us about a woman who had lived with a very amorous priest for many years and bore him 4 sons, 3 of whom became priests. So, I mean, look, that's just how it was. In the medieval church, the idea was very strong that Jewish people lived under the curse of being Christ killers, and so they were discriminated against. Jews weren't allowed to sell flour, wine, or oil, or clothing to Christians. And in some places, right along with Muslims and heretics and prostitutes, Jews were required to wear in public a circular patch of yellow felt to identify them as Jews, and so you could know who they were in the public. Astrology was used to explain things. For example, at the University of Paris, they decided that the bubonic plague of the 1340s was due to the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. By the 1200s, virtually all Christians were part of a geographically defined parish, in Europe at least, each with its own pastor. In 15th century England, there were about 9,500 parishes with 3 million people. Each parish was an average of roughly 300 men, women, and children. In addition to the prayers to the Trinity and to Jesus, medieval people would pray to the saints, and in some instances this moved to worship of the saints. Or they would spend more time at a shrine of Mary than they would at their own parish church. Christianity during this period tended to be very superstitious in its nature. Were there genuinely saved people? Of course there were. Of course there were people who had a simple faith in Jesus, oftentimes despite the church, not because of it. But Jesus always has his own from generation to generation. The biggest problem of this period, the biggest problem, was the Bible was not in the hands of the common people. Now, you would say, well, the common people were illiterate. Well, the church should have made them literate. That's what they did in succeeding generations and succeeding eras that we're going to talk about. The church had huge pushes for literacy, to teach people how to read, so the scriptures could be in their hand, so that people could read the Bible. But it's not too strong to say this. People were illiterate because the church wanted them to be illiterate. Wanted them to be illiterate. Where even back to my day, I can remember, and I don't know if Roman Catholics still say this today, but when I was a young man, they used to say it. Don't read the Bible. The priest will read the Bible and tell you what it means. So, that ethic carried back 1,000 years ago was very much the idea of we don't want the people to read. But things change when the Bible is put in the hands of common people. As we will see next lecture, when we begin to talk about the Reformation. Now, what we're going to talk about next time, not next week, no class next week. Bible College is on Outreach Week. But what we will talk about is the forerunners to the Reformation. It's going to get to a great section. Okay, questions? Anybody? Anything? Yes? Forerunners of the Reformation, the Valdenses. We're going to talk about the Valdenses, the Lollards, and John Huss. Yeah, these are great people. And let me tell you, the difference with all those people, is the Bible. The Bible. All right? Any questions or anything? All right, we're good.